I want to give an argument in favor of reparations provided to compensate persons whose ancestors were victims of historical injustices. I am in favor of reparations for myself. I need to begin with a solid foundation. For that I turn to the United States Constitution, Amendment 14, Section 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property, without due process of law. Nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So here is the foundation from Amendment 14. Privileges and immunities, another way of saying rights, are protected under the law. All citizens and individual citizens have these rights protected. There are no special groups or categories that have special protected rights. Protection of rights is equal, that is for each citizen as an individual and all citizens equally. My foundational premise is that all citizens of the United States are eligible for reparations for compensation for ancestors who were victims of historical injustice. I should ask, however, if a person such as I is eligible for such compensation. To answer that I must look at some definitions and facts. There are two types of slavery that have been practiced in the United States or in the British colonies that became the United States. These were chattel slavery and indentured servitude. Chattel slavery is a situation where one person is legally the property of another person and may be bought, sold, and inherited. Chattel slaves were usually involuntarily enslaved as the result of punishment, debt, or defeat in battle. Children of such slaves were also considered to be slaves. Indentured servitude is a situation in which one person contracts with another person to work for a period of time without wages in exchange for debt payment, subsistence, or other benefits. While most indentures were considered voluntary, many of these voluntary indentures were forced upon persons to pay costs for transportation to the British colonies in America or other debts. Indentures would also be involuntarily imposed as punishment or by coercion. Children could also be involuntarily indentured. Such was the case for one of my paternal ancestors who sold himself into indentured servitude for a period of 7 years in order to cover the cost of his transportation from Europe to America. From 1600 to 1775, which was the period of English colonization of America, there were about 500,000 chattel slaves in the 13 British colonies. There were also about 500,000 indentured servants in the British colonies. In addition, there were about 100,000 convicts and prisoners of war involuntarily transported to the colonies. These numbers do not include persons enslaved by Native Americans before and during the practice of chattel slavery in the colonies. Native Americans would enslave persons of any race including other Native Americans. During the colonial period, about two-thirds of the European immigration to the colonies was indentured, about 1,200,000. During this time there were no more than 500,000 chattel slaves in the colonies. From 1775 to 1860, that is the American Revolution to the Civil War, indentured servitude had ended and the number of chattel slaves had grown to about 4 million. No one would suggest that indentured servitude and chattel slavery are equivalent. Yet any observer of history will admit that there was some suffering and injustice in both situations. How much suffering is too much? How much injustice needs to be repaired? If all individual citizens are protected equally under the Constitution, then if one person is considered for reparations, then all should be considered. I will propose a very simple means of calculating an equitable consideration of all citizens for reparations. First, let us assume that from 1600 to 1860 there were 4 million persons in chattel slavery. The estimated life expectancy for a chattel slave was 21 years. 21 times 4 million is 84 million. Second, let us assume that in the same period there were 1.2 million indentured servants. The typical length of indentured servitude was 7 years. 7 times 1.2 million is 8.4 million. This may suggest an equitable comparison of suffering. Indentured servants suffered 10% of what chattel slaves suffered. The simplest and least expense calculation I have seen in my research is that each descendant of a chattel slave is paid between $10,000 and $20,000. Let us, for the sake of calculating, take the low number of $10,000. Valuing the suffering and injustice experienced by indentured servants at 10% of the suffering and injustice experienced by chattel slaves, it is equitable that $1,000 be paid to each descendant of an indentured servant. There is one more thing to consider. There was something called the Civil War. The story of my family is again critical, at least for me, as I make these calculations for equitable reparations for all persons. There was a benefit to the Civil War, and that benefit was the emancipation of chattel slaves. It could be argued that emancipation of slaves was not the only reason for the war, but for chattel slaves it was a 100% benefit. But what was the cost of this benefit? It is difficult to find accurate casualty reports for the Civil War. The lowest estimate of federal soldiers that died in the war for all reasons is 360,000. The estimate could be as high as 450,000. This number does include non-European Americans, for example, African Americans who served honorably, but since we are using the lowest estimate, for various reasons, we may assume that 360,000 was probably the number of European American deaths. We may estimate a total of 750,000 European American federal soldiers killed in action, wounded in action, missing in action, prisoners of war, and other considerations. This estimate does not include any civilian casualties. Using our estimate of 4 million chattel slaves in the United States at the beginning of the Civil War and of 750,000 European American casualties during the war, the emancipation of 5 chattel slaves cost 1 European American casualty. To say it another way, 1 emancipated slave cost 20% of a federal soldier casualty. Based on the smallest and simplest amount demanded for reparations of descendants of chattel slaves, $10,000, the amount owed to the descendants of federal casualties is $2,000 per casualty. As an example, let me use my own family story. First, my maternal ancestors came to the United States from Scotland through Canada to Michigan well after the Civil War. Second, my original paternal ancestor, the indentured servant, came from Germany through Pennsylvania to Indiana before the Civil War. 4 brothers in one family enlisted in the Federal Army. All 4 brothers were captured and sent to the infamous Andersonville prison camp. 3 died while prisoners of war at the camp. The surviving 4th brother was my direct descendant. So, none of my ancestors owned chattel slaves. My paternal ancestor was an indentured servant. 3/4 of my paternal ancestors died in the Civil War in the effort to emancipate slaves. Someone owes me $7,000 in reparations. Who should pay my reparations? I think that my reparations should come from 3 sources. First, since the Confederacy was formed by the political ancestors of today's Democrat Party, much of the suffering and injustice resulting from the Civil War should be borne by Democrats. Also, as a sign of appreciation and gratitude, the National African American Reparations Commission should share in the reparations I am owed. Finally, for the suffering and injustice of indentured servitude in the British colonies, the British royal family should pay a portion.